Quite simple. I grew up in a small iron mining town in northeast Minnesota, population 3,500, which
Right.
is still is today. And small town, good schools, and the dean of the junior college there said, look, there's somebody in town from the University of Chicago who's giving exams. If you score well, you get a scholarship. And I said, Dean, I won't do very much with that, you know. I've always underrated myself all my life and still do. But I took the exam and I won a full scholarship. And in 1933, the tuition was $150 a year.
Right.
To one of the best universities in America.
Sure.
But I did well there, and I got out of school, and I wanted to be a journalist. I was prompted to this partly by John Gunther, who was the great journalist of the Chicago Daily News Foreign Service, who his first book was Inside Europe, which is still the best book on Europe in the 30s before the war. And I heard him lecture at a Council on Foreign Relations talk downtown Chicago. And he really was a most remarkable man. And I listened to him and I said, that's what I'm going to be. I'm going to be a foreign correspondent. Well, there are various steps along the way. You don't graduate directly into it. And I really roamed around the whole goddamn country. My father staked me to running around to find this job.
Right.
And there were no newspaper jobs in 1933 to speak of. And I went all the way from Minneapolis, Louisville, St. Louis, everywhere, in New York, and came up with no job. And finally I was about to quit New York and go back to Ely, defeated. And I had met the man who ran the Foreign Policy Association in New York when he lectured at the university. And he said, you can't go back there. He said, that's a terrible thing to have. He said, I'm going to create a job for you. And he did, and he invited me down to Washington. I don't know what I was getting, $25 or $50 a week or month. Thank you, fellas.
Thank you so much.
Do you want cream?
A little cream would be fine, thank you.
That's fine, fellas. Just put it on. And my first job was to Capitol Hill to cover the Congress on foreign policy. And suddenly I was elevated into, and you know, I became a member of the Washington Press Corps, and I joined the press club and went there regularly. As a matter of fact, our office was in the press building, 12th floor. And
This was 1935?
this is 36.
36, yeah.
37, really.
Yeah.
And you know, this gets us to what Washington was in those days.
Yeah.
A small town. I talked about that a little bit earlier. Where did you hear of me?
I heard about you from, it was on a list of Nuremberg participants from Drexel Sprecher.
Yeah. Well, see, I was fascinated by the Nuremberg trials, but that wasn't my job.
Exactly.
I was doing various things in Germany. I was in the Berlin Bureau of Time. And
I'm really curious about 1937, what Washington was like.
well, that's what I'm going to get to.
Yeah, sure, okay.
The rest can wait.
Yep.
The center of Washington was 14th to death.
Right.
That was it. The Willard Hotel across the street and the press building.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were a few scattered things on the way to the White House. And then the other side of the White House, Pennsylvania Avenue, the other side of the White House was a series of pawn shops.
Right.
Nothing. No office building, no nothing. Everything 1 or 2 stories. And it was a small town, but this is Washington without television or radio.
Right.
And that meant that the press club, it's remarkable it survived, but they've survived by grabbing onto a lot of other things that boost its popularity. They've made it a window into the press currently. And
What did you cover principally during that time period?
the Congress. Legislation.
Right.
I'd go up there, and not only that, I talked to various people around. I got to be pretty good at that even at the beginning. I was a good interviewer. I knew what the hell to get and how to get it. And I've always had that facility, which is to put people at ease and to get them to talk, which is, it's part of the business. And I went on to use it for a lot of other work. But
Well, 1937 would have been when Franklin Roosevelt would have delivered the court packing legislation.
that's right.
Were you part of that coverage?
Well, no, I didn't cover that. But well, Washington was the kind of place where you could have lunch at the press club and meet almost everybody who knew something about it.
Right.
And I followed that very assiduously. Also, I was fascinated by Roosevelt. He was a giant,
Right.
even then.
Right.
And he was first imprinted upon my personality in Ely, Minnesota, during the Depression, when the banks failed. And there were, people don't realize now what the hell it was. They have, 5 million unemployed in the country? And the country was about to crash. And Roosevelt came along with this jaunty way of his, and he saved the whole goddamn thing. And then when I came to Washington, I discovered that Roosevelt's White House staff was about 8 or 9.
Right.
He pulled us through the Depression and the war with a staff no bigger than 10 or 15. Look what the hell it is now, hundreds all over the city bumping into themselves. And Roosevelt to me was well, let's say, I knew how major a figure he was. Mm-hmm. He just showed it. He had he would have, I'll rely on my notes, he would have 2 press conferences a week, one for the mornings and one for the afternoons. And they would crowd into this office of his, and he would sit there, smoking a cigarette and take the questions. But, other presidents have had that facility. I remember Truman was electioneering in Los Angeles when I was working for Newsweek. And he had a press conference at 8 in the morning. And everybody was sort of sleepy and they weren't coming up with questions. I remember Truman said, "What's the matter, boys? Running out of soap?" Well, Truman had a way of saying things vulgarly that Roosevelt was elegant with. And I guess the remarkable thing about my exposure to Roosevelt was that I knew he was a giant. He just was. And is today, when you compare him with all the others who since, they're quite diminutive, but they're less than he was. And
when you talk about, his group of 12, during that period of time, one of them was Robert Jackson.
That's right.
And he was there as a Solicitor General, Attorney General?
Well, Robert Jackson, though people have a memory, he may not have been a giant, but compared to the people who succeeded him, he was.
Right.
And I think I was at press conferences or something once or twice, but I never had much contact with him because that wasn't my job.
Right.
And, but he was one of the key people about Roosevelt, and I was fascinated by his role in the Nuremberg trial,
right,
just because I was interested in it. I was at Nuremberg a very short time. I was there between assignments, and I wasn't there long enough. I was there long enough to get to know all the correspondence,
mm-hmm, but
not to know the substance of the trial.
Right.
Correspondents are clubby, they feed on each other, and you get to know them all, and that was an interesting group.
Do you remember some of the people who some of your colleagues?
Steve Laird of Time magazine, and my wheels aren't grinding very well this morning.
And at this time, you were working with whom?
Well, I was working for, let's see, I was working for Time magazine in the Berlin Bureau.
Right.
I sure first should tell you about
Sure.
how I moved from one thing to another.
Absolutely, love to hear it.
I had 2 or 3 jobs. You know, to tell you about the things I've done, it would get you kind of tired of it.
Please, I'm here for you.
Okay. After the foreign policy thing ended, I went out to Chicago. The Federation, the university had something called the Public Administration Clearinghouse, which was the foremost organization for public administration. They trained people, and they had a lot of junior organizations. One of them was the Federation of Tax Administrators. And through somebody I'd known at the university,
University of Chicago.
yeah, they hired me, and they hired me to design and put out a monthly newsletter called the Tax Administrators News. And so for a year or 2, I followed tax news very carefully and got oriented in it rather well. And then I came back to Washington, and I worked for David Lawrence, who was then one of the giants of journalism. And he had a labor relations reporter that I worked for, so I covered labor relations. And then, then I went to work for the Department of Agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
I was out of a job, and I got my father to squeeze the chief Democrat in Minnesota, whom he always funded anyhow. And I got a job at the Department of Agriculture writing speeches for the head of AAA. Do you know AAA?
Yeah, sure.
Well, a lot of people don't.
Yeah, all right.
And so I did that for quite a while, and I got to know a lot about the way government works, because the Department of Agriculture was, no longer is, but it was the most important organization in the country that affected people's lives.
Right.
And AAA was it's been denounced since, but it kept a lot of farmers alive during that period. And I did that for a time, and then a friend of mine who got around and knew people, he said, he said, this goddamn war has come along and you aren't even connected with it. And I said, that's true, how do I do that? And he said, I think I can, through people I know, I can get you a job in the, I guess you could call the Office of Emergency Management. That for the war, that was the equivalent of this falderall that they have down in New Orleans.
Right.
You know.
Yeah.
And I went to work there for a speechwriter named Tom Wilson, whom I became involved with later in life as well. But he was a marvelous writer, and he was writing Roosevelt speeches. And he would come to me and he would say, look, Si, find something that will dramatize all these goddamn submarine losses.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought about that, and I found that a manifest of one ship that had, I don't know, milk and beef and everything else on it. And I worked out the acreage that this would represent and the number of cows and so on, and what that loss meant to people around the country. And so I gave this to Tom, and he said, perfect, do some more of that.
Right.
So, you know, I was helping to write Roosevelt speeches, but I was learning a lot about speech writing in the process.
Sure.
I've at various times in my career or life since, I've had to write speeches, and it's one of the chief ways that you influence policy in Washington. You know, if you're a bright guy and you know how to write speeches and have a good relationship, you can change things. And so I did that for a while, and then I got drafted and sent overseas. I went to Air Intelligence School, and I went overseas and was assigned to the 9th Air Force in London. And they looked at me and they said, well, you're probably all right for public relations. So they assigned me to the 9th Air Force newsroom in London. And of course, London during the war was heaven for anybody with curiosity about Europe, because it was the center of everything. And I was working with two New Yorker writers who'd been drafted. And, you know, I didn't know, they both became famous since. I didn't think they were. And but I didn't have a whole lot to do, and I used my curiosity to learn about London. I walked the goddamn streets of London until I knew corners, various odd corners of it. And I always had that curiosity about great cities. But London was the first European city that I could emphasize city in. And then I got transferred 9th Air Force to an Air Force base. These are fighter bombers, which assist the infantry and then move around and come back again. And we were at a base in southern England, southeast England, and I remember when the first buzz bombs came over. We didn't know what the hell they were, and we were sleeping in holes in the ground. And well, you know, I better save some of my throat for the most important things. But anyhow, I was moved from there. We moved from there to an air base in northwest France, right near Mont Saint-Michel, which is that wonderful island of a castle
Right.
jutting up into the sky. We were 4 miles from it.
No kidding.
And so I decided I was going to get to Paris. You know, in Paris it had just been opened up, and the Germans just chased out, and
This would have been 1944?
yeah,
Yeah, 44, yeah.
and on the back of a truck from an air base.
Did you really?
Yeah, and I remember the reason I remember the air base we landed at is it's the only time that I ever saw Rebecca West, who was one of the milestones of my life afterwards. And I was too shy to get up and talk to her. But I got into town, and I rode into Paris on the back of an army truck, and I said, I don't know where the hell the rest of the war is going. I know where I'm going. And so I had one thing against me, and that is I had been AWOL, and it was on my regular 66-1
Right.
that you carry around and present to the officer in charge when you change stations. And I knew I could never get promoted. And I went up to the air base had moved up since. And I went there and I saw Mike Ingalito was in charge of one of the squadrons, and a very mature man. And I said, well, I'm assigned to Stars and Stripes, but oh no, I got into Paris, and somebody said they let me off at a garage, and it said Stars and Stripes on it. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that this was the garage where all their Jeeps were, and the headquarters was a half a block up on the Rue de Berry. And I remembered that that I had known a colleague in Washington who said that if you ever run into Colonel Goodfriend, who is in Special Services, U.S. Army, Stars and Stripes and so on, just mention my name. And so I checked into the Stars and Stripes. Goodfriend was across the street in a hotel. I knocked on his door at 8 in the morning, and he said, come on in. And I told him that I wanted to get transferred from the 9th Air Force to Stars and Stripes, and I was a friend of Paul Talbot, and he said, oh, I think we can do that. And so here I was, I landed in Stars and Stripes, and it was a small newspaper. I was one of 2 officers on the paper who wrote. Otherwise, all enlisted men, they hated officers, and, but the both of us were tolerated. And it was different than anything I'd ever done before. I was the only man on the staff who knew the world, in a sense. You know, I'd been to a first-class university, I'd read widely, I was way ahead of, these guys were all working stiffs and very good reporters. And so I really became the guy to write interpretive pieces for the paper, war crimes trials and so on. And
How long were you with Stars and Stripes then?
I was with Stars and Stripes for 1.5 years of the war, maybe 2 years.
No kidding.
Yeah, a long time. And I remember a good friend called me in one day, and he said, look, he said, a huge chunk of the U.S. Army is going to be in Germany in a matter of weeks. And he said, you've got 1.5 million guys, they don't know beans about Germany.
Right.
Now you sit down and write them something.
I'll be there.
And so I said, okay. And I didn't have any library except the World Almanac.
Right.
But on the other hand, I had a very retentive memory and always have had. And so, and I remembered a lot of the things that I knew that I found some book on the history of Germany.
Keep going. The same.
Are you recording?
No, we're all set. Yep.
Good. In all of this, I wrote, I don't know, I think I wrote a 5,000-word piece about Germany, you know, just overnight. And it was great. Everybody liked it. And it was very necessary because, you know, you were presenting these guys with, theoretically, they've been trained about Germany, but they knew nothing about it. And my piece was a great fill-in. It wasn't everything, but it helped. And I was with Stripes, and also once the war was over, I was able to travel, and I could go almost anywhere. And I wrote orders to go to, my first trip was Vienna, Budapest, and Belgrade. And this was to change my life, because I had been most interested in Eastern Europe of all, and Rebecca West's books had been a great shove-on with that. But
Well, tell me about Rebecca West there, because she, you know, was one of the foremost reporters at the Nuremberg trial.
That's right.
The first one.
yeah, and she wrote a good book about it.
And how, did your paths cross with hers? Were you
No,
a
no.
wonderful observer?
No, our paths never crossed, unhappily. I know all about her and read everything about her. And I have, in my study in the other room, I have 10 books by or about Rebecca West.
No kidding.
And she was a great lady.
Right.
And, but you see, I had very little connection with Nuremberg. I know all about Jackson, and I admired him because of what I knew about him in Washington.
What did you know about him at that time? As you know, you're in Europe at the time, and all of a sudden, Jackson...
well, he was one of, you know, Roosevelt couldn't have done what he did without a half a dozen great people around him, and he was one of them.
Right.
And he shone, and he had stature. You know, when he walked into a room, you knew this was a man in charge, and he was to be taken seriously. And everything he said or did made a lot of sense if you were a Democrat,
Right.
Which I was. And we went through the Depression in Dealey, Minnesota, and my mother, you know, when everything crashed, she said, thank God we have Roosevelt in Washington. So this was imprinted on my mind very, very early. And where were we on this?
We're just Jackson. We sort of segued over a little bit. You know,
Yeah, interrupt me whenever you like.
Yeah, Simon Bourgin at this point is simply saying, I'm a reporter, I'm a Democrat, I'm from Minnesota, I'm a Roosevelt fan, and here's Jackson, one of the insiders there, and not only was he certainly in the administration, but even when you're in Germany, in Berlin, at the end of the war, you're probably reading and maybe even writing a little bit about the upcoming war crimes trial, which had never occurred before.
Well, I'll tell you, I wrote a couple of interesting pieces for Stripes of lesser trials for war criminals.
Right, go ahead.
And they made a little bit of a splash. But I was never assigned to Nuremberg, and I followed it, but didn't know very much about it. You know, I read everything in the papers about it during that time, and I have a firm imprint of it on my mind. But I really can't elaborate very much because my experience didn't go in that direction.
On the subsequent trials, did you attend a couple of the subsequent trials at Nuremberg?
No.
No, just you wrote about them?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you write about them?
I wrote some pieces for Stripes, but I can't remember now what. I've got this file on the Stripes during that time, but there was so much other stuff.
Oh, sure.
It would be fruitless to look for them.
No. Did your paths ever cross with either Alan Dreyfus or Norbert Ehrenfreund?
Alan Dreyfus is one of my closest friends.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah, yeah. We were together. He was on Stripes for a while, I think.
Right.
And he had this lovely Czech wife, Czech by descent, and I saw a lot of them while we were in Europe, and then they visited me here in Washington. And when you first called me on this thing, I kept thinking, what the hell was the name of my friend who was in Detroit, who was at the Nuremberg trials? That was Ellen.
Yeah.
And I had a lovely Christmas card from him, as usual. You can give me his address later on, because I don't have it. But Ellen was one of those very bright people who knew everything. He was smart. You can separate the reporters who are intellectuals, and they generally know more.
Right.
And
when you were over there in Berlin, did your paths cross with some of the younger, now more known correspondents, whether it was Edward R. Murrow or whether it was Walter Cronkite or Richard Hotelet or any of that group? Did your paths?
you're getting onto something. That'll take an extra half hour.
I'm here.
Okay. Hotelet was, well, first of all, I knew all those CBS guys.
Right.
And I knew Murrow best of all in a way because when I was at this air base in southern England, I phoned Murrow and said, why don't you come here and do some hometowners on this interesting group? They're all fighter pilots. Fighter pilots are different, and which they are and were. And he said, I'll put it on my schedule. And he showed up there. And he interviewed all these guys. And of course, that one, and everything was audio then. There was no film.
Right.
And he did a number of broadcasts about these guys. And of course, that sent my popularity in the base skyrocketing. But Murrow was in London, and I would go up there occasionally. Whenever I went to London, I would look in on him. We developed a conversational friendship, and I'm trying to get this sequence straight. It's a war story that'll take a while. I better leave that and go on to other things.
Sure. But that CBS, Howard K. Smith.
Well, I'll tell you, in a nutshell, what it adds up to is that Murrow had the good sense when he created this. Well, he didn't create the networks. He found himself having to make broadcasts at the start of the war when he was in Europe on an educational mission of some kind. That was his business and trade at that time.
Sure.
And he did one or two experimental broadcasts that were great. And they said, well, look, we need the same, now that goddamn war's on, we need the same from here, there, and there. And he remembered colleagues whom he knew, or he knew of them with their reputation, and he called them up and said, look, this is fast overnight, but I need you to broadcast tomorrow about this goddamn war. And they all responded. It became CBS News.
I'll be darned.
And Hodlett, I got to know all these guys very well. Hodlett was very, very good, but a cold fish, in contrast to the others. His colleagues who didn't particularly like him said it was the German part of his heritage.
Right.
And, but I got along very well with Hodlett. Alex Kendrick became my closest friend. And he wound up in Vienna for CBS after the war, and we were colleagues for years. And when he retired finally, I would go up to Philadelphia and visit him every 2 weeks until he died. And these were men of such extraordinary substance that you can't even compare them with the bums running around today with big names. Right. And let's see, who are the others that you mentioned?
Howard K. Smith.
Howard K. Smith was a great gentleman, and he just had marvelous quality as a person. And I ran into him once I was covering the Italian first post-war elections, which the communists might win, and I was in Milan, and we were lunching, and I said, your man in Vienna, I don't know whether it was Kendrick or whoever, that is going back to the States, and what are you going to do for a fill-in? And Howard said, what about you? I said, I've never broadcasted. And he said, well, you can, you will. And so I became CBS in Vienna, and I did that for about a year, and then another year after that, I did it for NBC. And I got onto the hang of that very quickly. It's a very effective way of conveying news. And but Kendrick was my model. Right. Kendrick would get New York, you know, in those days you went down to RCA Communications and you logged in to get 15 minutes of airtime and so on. And then you either spoke or read. And Kendrick, they would call him up and give him 15 minutes, and he would talk in a monologue with everything organized. It was a great, great skill, and I was in awe of it. But Kendrick was one of those sturdy people who, you know, I was ready to emulate him in every way. His values were so great, and his ability to handle news and so on. They were all extraordinary men. Of the like, you know, if you looked around the news business today, you wouldn't find anybody quite like them. Right. The most important thing is they were grounded in newsrooms. They learned about news writing for newspapers. And in other words, they knew about news in depth without having to call it that. Right. And the chief thing to distinguish these people who are doing news today is that they're almost all products of radio or television. The last one to work in a newspaper, I think, was North Dakota. What's his name again?
Jennings? Was it Peter Jennings or Brokaw?
Brokaw.
Yeah,
Brokaw.
Brokaw, yeah.
And Brokaw always, he's fascinated because he got by on so little. He was very intelligent and very smart. And he became a great booster of Joe Layton. Have you heard about Joe?
Joe?
Well, Joe was my closest friend.
Is that right?
Year after year until he died. I went to his home to bring him some soup that my housekeeper made all the way out in Bethesda. And nobody answered, but he was dead in his bed upstairs.
That'll be darn.
And I was, you know, we got involved in Los Angeles, but I'll get to that later. But the chief thing that distinguishes these guys today from these people we're talking about, is there any others of that crowd that you think
Walter
of?
Cronkite, of course, was a print guy at the time.
Yeah, Walter Cronkite I knew, but not intimately.
Right.
And I'm not sure anybody knew him intimately. Well, everybody knew him, but
right.
Walter Cronkite had a marvelous facility for a band of experience that was like that, but it didn't go up or didn't go down very much. He turned out to be the perfect guy for communication of his time, and of course he made an imprint. He should have had. And who else in that CBS crowd? Oh, Hodlett and I were covering the Austrian State Treaty when it was announced, the end of the occupation in Vienna. And we both broadcast from the GI Club downtown, which had a telephone thing where you could talk to New York, and we would log in for some time. And I listened to Hodlett do his broadcast, and he said, "The city is in ferment. Everybody is so joyous that they're jumping up and down on the street." Wait a minute. And he said, "It'll never be forgotten." So I came on after him. He lingered to wait for me to make my piece, and I said, "The curious thing about the state treaty today, which is signed today, is that I've never seen the city so calm."
Is there
I said, "There's no jubilation, there's no jumping in the streets," and so on. And we looked at each other and shrugged when he got out. And we just had different stories and different views. Anyhow, Hodlett was a stickler, and you know, his broadcasts were always very specific and very accurate. Andy Rooney, I came to know on Stars and Stripes, and Andrew Rooney may be the best writer that came out of the war in many ways. Oh yeah, he's a wonderful writer. He's a dedicated writer. You know, he works for CBS and he does this column still, and he writes these wonderful scripts for CBS when he does a show. He did one on New York skyscrapers and so on. I used to lunch regularly with Andy in New York until people who get older guide their time and energy more carefully. Now we just talk on the phone, but I miss him. And Andy is the kind of man who, he told me over lunch one day, he said, "You know," he said, "I write this goddamn column and I keep turning out these books, and my agent called me up the other day and said, I have a check for you for several $100,000. And he said, "My God."
Yeah.
You know, he was a genuinely humble man. And the one thing he does, he collects typewriters. He's afraid, you know, one of them is going to jam. He's got old typewriters. They're all perfect and up to date in his cellar. And I know how he feels, because when my typewriter goes on the blinks, I still don't have a computer.
Right.
I'm paralyzed.
Right.
But anyhow, I can't say enough for Andy Rooney and for Alec Kendrick. They're different kinds, but very, very unusual men and professionals at their business. Any other personalities that you think of?
No, those are the ones that come to mind. We've already talked about Rebecca West and the CBS folks.
Well, Rebecca West. I come from a little town in northern Minnesota, which is half Finnish and half Slovenian. They were Austrians when they came.
Right.
And I knew about Yugoslavia before anybody else did, because I remember one day at school recess, I must have been 10, and I ran into a Yugoslav friend, Tony Antosic, who said, "Have you heard they have a new name for the old country?" When you ask people where they came from the old country.
Right.
They have a new name, it's called Yugoslavia. This was, what the hell, 1919 or 1920 when it was created.
Right.
And, you know, that imprint stayed. And then, very early in the business, where the hell would I have been? I was probably home on leave. Oh, I know this is before I'd gone overseas. In Ely, this was 1931 or 2. Louis Adamic's first book came out called The Native's Return. He was a Slovenian who made good as a journalist and writer in America.
Right.
And I wrote him a letter and said, you know, this wonderful book, what about this, what about that? And he said, I'm going to be flacking my book up your way. Can you come to Duluth, which is where I'm going to be? And so I went up to Duluth and we got acquainted, had lunch and took a long walk. And he said, I want you to be sure to keep in touch with me because it's important to both of us. And Adam, you know, one of the things I've been able to do all my life is to attract people who are truly interesting, and they become interested in me. And I never work at it, but it's been greatly in my favor.
I can see why, by the way.
And Adamek, when I was at the University of Chicago, and he flew back and forth across the country lecturing and so on, he would always stop and see me. And it's a friendship that lasted until his, until his death. He either died or was murdered by Croatian Ustashi in that farm. It wasn't a farm, it was one of those places where people live, and they called it a farm outside of New York and New Jersey. And I had visited him there not many months before that. And he had been attacked, taking a long walk on the beach. He had been attacked by Croatian Ustashi, you know, the wild ones, who felt he had slighted their country. And he had survived that and everything. And my connections with Adamek there were very many, and it's a separate story all by itself, but I have all of his books in the next room. And through Adamek, I met, when I worked in Los Angeles as a journalist, I looked up Kerry McWilliams, who was the labor lawyer in California, and who wrote a splendid book about California agriculture, the best one. But I got to know him very well, and I visited him when he moved to New York, and he said to me, I said, you know, there's no biography of Louis. He said, why? He said, there's not, and why don't you write it? Mm-hmm. And I said, you know, I said the equivalent of who, me? He said, look, you know him better than anybody, and you can write. Why the hell don't you write it? Well, I'm very good at talking about these things, but I never got to do that.
Right.
And I should have written about Adamek because I really knew more about him than most others. And you know, in the same way, and it may be boredom in this thing, but it's worth telling. I was working for Newsweek in Los Angeles, and I had lunch with the great American historian. The name will come. His book's in the other room too. And I was then covering the movie industry, among other things, and we weren't talking about film, about which I learned a good deal. And I said, you know, I've been through the whole section on film in the University of California Library in Los Angeles, and I said, there isn't a really good history of film for the popular person. He said, why didn't you write it? I said, who, me? And he said, look, all I can tell you is that the one that's going to be written before very long is not going to be as good as the one you would write. Mm-hmm. Well, see, I've been urged to do that a number of times. Not Henry Steele commentary, who the hell was it anyhow? But you know, that was my association with Adamek, and it helps explain why my Ely connection opened up into the world. You know, Louis Adamek, Rebecca West, right. And I guess that this is probably a good time. What the hell have I got here? Oh, you know, I might as well give you a little bit of this.
Sure, absolutely, love it. Please do.
I said that Oh, news in America. It flows east to west, never from west to east. In the Los Angeles Times, it's been its bitter pill since news was broken up and became more competitive. And the Washington Times, the Los Angeles Times has been called a tip sheet for the Washington Post, because what comes out, they can do something with it. And the LA Times now is a good deal less than it was when I wrote this, but even so, and I remark here about the fact that I said the Washington Post, whatever anybody thinks of it, is the Bible of Congress. It's read on the Hill in the same way the Variety is read by show business people. There was a survey done here once which they asked the administrative assistants of all members to list the newspapers that they read of importance, if they read them. The New York Times was read by a couple of dozen people only.
Is that right?
The Washington Post was read by every single member, and why not?
Sure.
And what else would there have been? The Washington Post, New York Times. The conservative paper here is not read, it's looked at but not read by anybody except the people who want to read it because they fervently believe the junk that's in it. And I remark here about the fact that columnists matter less, because in my world when I grew up, columnists were the powerful instrument to convey the news. Jack Anderson, he would create news for weeks by something he wrote.
Right.
And Alsop and, well, the Alsop brothers ran a column for a long time when I first came here. They were in the press building just across the hall. And this was at a time when men of real intellect wrote for newspapers. It's gone.
Right.
They wouldn't get near a newspaper now, and nobody would read it if they did.
Right.
It's a little bit like movies. I asked a friend of mine, a New Yorker, produces film, why films aren't better today, and he said, like they used to be, and he said, because nobody who acted in those pictures that you think are so great could get a job today. The whole thing has changed. And the same thing is true about columns. These are men of very considerable intellect and wide knowledge, and how could you do better than the Alsop brothers writing a column?
Sure.
And oh, here's another thing. The problem of getting a story into your newspaper or magazine if you were overseas, because they would sort of downgrade you as, what the hell's that over in Vienna? And I said, if you can tell your desk that the New York Times is going to run this story, they'll probably ask you to do it. And well, I'll remark here that the problem with TV that it turns on issues, it turns issues into personalities,
right,
which is not the way you learn anything. And it turns reality into melodrama. It can't help itself. It's the nature of the medium. And to wish it weren't so is like wishing silent movies hadn't turned into talkies. It's gone.
Yeah, exactly.
And also, the camera limits what television carry because the camera requires action, and most important events take place behind closed doors.
Right.
And then I list a couple of things here that have happened to television. TV news is persistently less visual. Reporters and anchormen refuse to shut up and let this camera tell the story. TV news completely subordinated pictures to talk. And Reuben Frank, who died the other day, wrote a wonderful book about it. Ex-NBC news president used to call it television for the blind. The second thing that's happening to TV news is that it's getting softer, and it will get softer still. The biggest growth has been not in network news, but in local news, that gives personality interviews in sports. And then a remark about the changing of the guard at the, the anchors. Well, they're now all gone, except for Tom Brokaw, who was sort of hanging on. But they really weren't that good. They were awful, in fact, in terms of getting news. But there's something in the American psyche that requires a face in order to believe what the hell is said. And I don't think a psychologist could help you anymore, but it has to do with the endless fascination for anchors here. And they become almost mythological creatures. And the British and Germans and the French who do the best news, they call them readers, which is what they are.
Right.
And there's no glamour connected with them. And then I remarked, I quote Tom, do you read Tom Shales in the Washington Post?
I know, yeah.
He's very good.
Very good, yeah.
He's about the only one who has a long perspective on TV news and writes brilliantly about it. But he says in 20 years, the definition of news will be entirely different. TV's old fogies who work for newspapers and went to journalism school will be dead, and news will be in the hands of people who knew only TV. And then I work here on the fact that the government press do they have to be adversaries? And I quote Hedley Donovan, who was a reporter on the Post when I knew him, very early at the game when I'd come to Washington. Hedley Donovan came from Minneapolis, and we had a bond between us. But he later became the editor of Time magazine and working for Henry Luce in New York. And he said something interesting. He said, the press sees government as a colossus. Its key officials protected by mass ranks of public relations officers. He said, for the press, but he said, the White House looks out, it sees the enormous press corps, 4,000 accredited correspondents waiting to pounce, and since government breaks the good news first, anything broken by the press becomes negative.
Right.
An ad on the president and the press. Kennedy was very good at it, but only FDR was the master of it. Before FDR, no president took direct questions. It's hard to believe. FDR was his own chief of staff. Can you imagine that? And the vice president today has a larger staff than FDR when he was dealing with the Depression and World War II. Well,
How did FDR do a press conference? Would he invite you into the Oval Office?
yeah, exactly. The press were let in. They were did twice a day, morning and afternoon press, and there was only press, no radio or TV. And the door would open, they'd be in, and he would greet them, and he would probably be smoking out of that long cigarette holder.
Right.
And he would say the equivalent of Truman, running out of soap, but he would say it in a gentlemanly way if they didn't come forward with questions, or they would storm him with questions if something truly interesting had happened. And they ran for 15 minutes to half an hour. All the questions were direct. None of them were planted. It was a kind of heaven that the public would wish for.
Right.
And of course, it only happened in heaven, really. And where did we leave off on what I was doing where? Do you remember?
Now, let's see. You were in Stars, we did the Stars and Stripes,
Yeah.
and,
And I just began to work, oh, I know. I did my first trip into Eastern Europe.
right.
And Vienna didn't look all that interesting to me. and then I went on to Budapest, and I stayed there. Where the hell is that Lee Miller book?
Wild Bill Donovan.
Who took over? Who became the first head of OSS? It wasn't Donovan.
I don't know.
Donovan created the climate which made it possible.
Correct, correct.
Who was the first head of OSS? Because he's the man I knew the most about. And my friend Robert Homme, who produced his films, thought that he might make a film about this man and his association with Donovan. I've got the script of that somewhere, but you know, I never thought I would have to fetch it out. You know, my memory's pretty good, but and I never thought I would forget his name. But one of the problems with aging is things drop out of your mind. Names drop out of your mind.
Sure.
See, I wrote a script for what was going to be a film about this man. It wasn't about Donovan, it was about the man who took over the OSS afterwards.
You mean from Donovan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, wait, I have a book here.
Sure.
I spoke about my father fishing in Minnesota,
Right.
and
What's this, Simon Bourgin,
Mr. Nickel West here. When I was covering, after a while, I became so involved in Budapest that the journalist who fled the country because of communism signed. Well, I think it says Simon loves Hungarian women. And then it's got my initials, and this is my car that I was driving around, a big Buick, and this shows there's a barbed wire fence for the frontier,
I'll be darned.
and it shows my initial is around a beautiful lady who was kissing me over the frontier.
Right.
It's kind of cute. And my involvement with the space program, which is a separate story. These are autographs from the original moon landing crew, and this is Frank Borman's photograph that he took from the moon when they went around it for the first time, and that shows Earth showing up in the distance.
Right.
And this is from the first moon landing, and
Whose bust is that? Is that you?
the bust is me, and it was made in Budapest by Kis-Valódi Strobel, who is the best known sculptor of Central Europe. And Strobel made, if you ever go to Budapest, he made that great monument to the liberation of
Right.
the hill.
Oh, sure.
And we got to be good friends, and this came out of it. It's pretty good.
It is terrific. Nickel West. Did your paths cross with Donovan's at all? Did you ever get a chance to meet him?
No, never.
Yeah.
Well, Donovan died early, didn't he?
Fairly young, right?
Yeah.
He was also from Buffalo area.
Oh, I know. See, that's the reason I mentioned Buffalo, because I interviewed somebody who told me that Donovan was the kind of man who, he belonged to the most exclusive club in Buffalo.
Mm-hmm.
And they were serving liquor in off hours or something like that. He turned them in. And
You're right. That's a
And
good.
somebody from Buffalo was telling me about this, and they said, what kind of man would that be? And I said, well, that was Donovan.
Donovan, oh, yeah, absolutely. There's no question. He was a public defender or something like that, and
Yeah.
that's what happened. He turned in his own guys.
Yeah. See, I collected so much material on Donovan that my friend Robert Homme, who produces films in New York, said, you know, why the hell don't you write me a script about it? And so I did, and he said, well, there isn't enough there for my kind of film.
Great.
So that never happened. But I did collect a lot of stuff, and if I can find that, and Homme has no objection, I'm sure he won't, I could send that to you.
I would love that very much, because it would certainly add a little more local flavor.
Oh, exactly, yeah. Yeah, I got very involved with what Buffalo was.
Yeah.
And everybody I've met from Buffalo since has been a little bit different than other places.
No question about it. So your story, you do end up in basically, Hungary is where you spent.
Well, I'll tell you. In Hungary, I met Robert Homme, who was my closest friend.
Right.
Still. A very successful independent producer of films for TV and television in New York. And I was based in Vienna for, what, 6 or 8 years? And Hungary was, Vienna was fascinating for a whole lot of reasons. It was important to me because it's where the Russians and Americans faced each other the way they did in Germany and Berlin. But Hungary is much more lively. First of all, I couldn't get visas for Poland at all, or Czechoslovakia. That was out. I was supposed to cover Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. And at one time when I was offered a trip to either Warsaw or Bucharest, I chose Bucharest. And that turned out to be very important for a lot of reasons. I'm still deeply involved in Romania. And because of my friendship with Homme and the doors he could open for me in Budapest, Budapest became the most important place to me. As a matter of fact, on the first trip, I met Homme with Lee Miller, a Vogue magazine photographer who has since become well known, a friend of mine.
Well, for our tape, could you explain who Homme was?
Homme was his father was a photographer to the Hungarian court. And the best known photographer, portrait photographer in Budapest, that picture of me over there is by him in uniform over there.
Right.
This is painted by my friend who was a close friend of his 2 years later than the one in the bedroom.
Oh, be darned.
And this looks as if I still come from Minnesota.
Yeah, that's right.
And Homme was, I met him when he was just released from a slave labor camp that the Germans had him in. Mm-hmm. And there he was, as you know, acting as guide, interpreter, and everything else for Lee Miller, who had developed quite a reputation for herself as a combat photographer in World War II. She did remarkable photographs of, she had a picture taken in the, I'll find that goddamn book before I leave here. Something like this. When I came to Budapest, the hotels had, right after the war, the hotels had all been shot up in the siege. And a lady named, a nun named Sister Margit, M-A-R-G-I-T, who was fervently anti-communist, opened her doors to the American press and diplomats. They could stay at her convent, which is where I wound up. And my roommate was John Phillips of Life. I was Time. It was Luce's room. And Phillips remained my close friend until he died a couple of years ago. I would go up to New York and I would see Phillips and then Homme. Now it's just Homme. But Lee made quite a reputation for herself. There are now about 5 books written about her. Mm-hmm. But she made a considerable reputation for herself as a personality, and early on she was a great beauty, as those pictures will show. And but she developed an affection for me And I saw her once in England. She married a very wealthy Englishman, an art collector and painter. I saw her only once after that. But it's interesting, there were three, and my first long visit, I was there for over a month. And I was there so long that I went from there to Belgrade. I stopped writing for the Stars and Stripes. I was writing one night, and Phillips came and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "What do you think I'm doing?" "I'm writing for the newspaper." He said, "Stop that stuff." He said, "Close up your typewriter." He said, "You're living in a country and society that has been turned upside down. You'll never see anything like it again.
Right.
Here you are writing your goddamn typewriter. Now go out and learn about it." So I stopped filing. And I forgot that you're supposed to file as a journalist.
Yeah.
Everything was so exciting. And I went down to Belgrade, and checked into the embassy, and the military attaché said, "You're Bourgin?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "There's a missing persons warrant out for you from Stars and Stripes in Paris. They think you've been scragged and dumped into the Danube." I never let them know what the hell I was doing, and I stayed there for 5 weeks.
Oh my God.
And anyhow, that was my, that was the beginning of my, you see, that was Louis Adamek continued.
Right.
And I made new friends in Belgrade who mattered, journalists. One of them, a lady, Desaborn, until she died a year or two ago. I went back repeatedly to Budapest because it was only, it was only 3 or 4 hour ride. And
You were there during 1956, weren't you? When
I left, that's another story.
Yeah.
I was there, look, first of all, I'd been there off and on continuously for about 6 years. I was the only American correspondent who really knew quite a bit about the place.
Right.
I didn't speak Hungarian, but I learned very early on that if you make the right contacts, you don't have to learn the local language, although it's better if you do. And I was there until, I did my last visit there until just before, the weekend before the revolution started. And I went back to Vienna and I said, "Look, enough of Eastern Europe." I said, "I've exhausted this place, both Vienna and Budapest, and I can't get back to Bucharest for various reasons." And I said, "I'm going back home." And what had happened was that I'd had dinner with John Denson, the editor of Newsweek, who came to Vienna. Somebody said, "Look me up." And he said to me, "You aren't by any chance getting tired of this place, are you?" And I said, "Well, yes." I said, "I'm about to leave." And he said, "Why don't you go to work for me?" And I said, "At what?" And he said, "West Coast correspondent in Los Angeles." I said, "Well, that sounds pretty good," for a man who didn't have a job. And so I left Vienna and drove my car to Paris. And then I got on the phone with Melvin Lasky, editor of Encounter magazine, and one of the best journalists of his time. And he said, "What the hell is going on in Budapest?" And I said, "Oh, not very much." I said, "Why do you think I left?" "Because those people are so tired and dirty and hungry, and everything, they've had everything done but shat upon." And I said, "Nothing's going to come out of that." And he said, "Oh," he said, "I learned on the radio a few hours ago that they broke into the office of Radio Budapest and dumped the whole crew out of the windows from the 6th story." So I said, "Oh, really?" So, okay, then the news began coming back. And I heard it crossing the ocean. When I got to New York, I heard it again. And obviously there was, the revolution had started. And I got into my car and began driving across the country, listening to the radio. And about 5 times I pulled over to the side of the road and said, I could break off here and drive up to Chicago and take an airplane back. but I have no job. I have no outlet. And by this time, all the people who were interested had gotten their own correspondence in.
Right.
And a correspondent who had just arrived there is far more important than one who had left there.
Right.
And so I was foxed out of that. And I should have regretted it. I did regret it because, look, at the same time, another job layer that I haven't inflicted on you, in Vienna, I had a phone call from C.D. Jackson, who was the publisher of Time, Life, and Fortune, and he had a very sophisticated, interesting man. He had grown up in Paris, perfect French, and he was head of the Committee for Free Europe, which sponsored Radio Free Europe, raised all of its money, and he said, look, we've got this big operation going in Munich, Radio Free Europe. You know, he's like, I can't tell you how much it costs, and it's got presumably very good staff. But he said, we don't have anybody we know who really can tell us what the hell is going on there, what kind of an organization it is. He said, why don't you go up there every weekend for a matter? I went up there every weekend for 2 years, and I developed my own contacts, and I came to know members of the staff who were anxious to tell me everything that was going on. I would feed this stuff back to New York, and so that was another part of my life. And one of the interesting things about that is that when I came back from one of my trips to Budapest, I would meet with the Hungarian staff, and I would talk about what I'd seen, and the transcripts of my talks have since become important documents on what happened there during the revolution. And I never thought that much about it until they were printed. And they've been printed 3 times in different magazines and journals. They're one of the basic documents. And of course, when you're in your 30s or 40s or whatever the hell it was, you know, you can sit down. I talked without notes for almost an hour.
Right.
And everything came out perfectly. And of course, you look at it and you say, how the hell did I do that? But anyhow, the stuff that came out in my little talks afterwards turned out to be among the few basic documents, because I was the only person who knew. I'd written these talks, I'd done these talks 2 or 3 times, and they each covered a different period. My time in Budapest was far from wasted, because I had a perspective that correspondents who arrived there last week, you know, John McCormick of the New York Times, who was the senior man on Eastern Europe in Vienna, and we were close friends. We went to Hungary a number of times together, and he sent me a letter. He's the only thing wrong with my covering the revolution was that you weren't there. Yeah. So that's how I got deeply involved. Lee Miller, it's written by Carolyn Burke, who came to me one day, sent by John Phillips up in New York. She said, I'm doing a book on Lee Miller. She had written 1 or 2 splendid biographies, and she lives in Santa Cruz, California, is married to a Eastern Europe expert. And she said, I'm doing this book on Lee Miller, and I've already interviewed John, who has told me that you're the other part of this story. Because Lee lived next to John and I. There was a door that separated our rooms. And John was probably the finest talker that I've ever known in ordinary conversation. Inexhaustible. He'd had even more experiences than I had. He had grown up on a ranch in Algeria. He had an American mother who came out of the Singer sewing machine family, and a French father who had become a farmer in Algeria, for Christ's sake. And so when that failed, he spent his time around Paris cafes with his father. And he spoke perfect French, and he's written about 6 books. I have 3 or 4 of them in the other room. And John and I were the closest of friends. I once persuaded him to go to the Mayo Clinic with me to get an examination. He was headed his wife was headed for that big heart clinic in Texas. And I said, John, if you're just getting examination, why don't you go to Rochester? And I said, we'll have a lot of time to talk. And he did go. Right. And we talked on the nights when we could drink. We drank marvelous wine and food together. And when I came back, my wife said, she said, you and John are the only people I know who could turn a visit to the Mayo Clinic into a spa. But John and Bob they both wound up in New York as fairly notable figures, and Hominy still is. And so that's part of it. My Yugoslav connection lasted until Bourgin died a year or two ago. I don't know anybody there anymore. And
did your paths ever cross Tito's?
No, but I went to his press conferences regularly.
Did you?
He was a master of it.
Tell me about him. And you walk in a room, describe him. I always found him an intriguing historical figure.
He is. I have in the other room, if I can find it, a photograph I took of him, a very good one. And the photography is another thing we might talk about. But once a year, he lives in a house called the White House, a small mansion. And once a year at his birthday, he opens it up to the foreign press. And we could all come and you know, we could talk. I talked with him there, but you know, you can't do interviews. But I took a picture of him that's marvelous. I think I can dig it out. And it's going to go in this book that a friend of mine is trying to put together. And he handled, you know, we had a press conference, I've got some photographs of that too, a huge room with 100 or 150 reporters. And he had a press secretary, Spyro, something, what the hell ever it was, who he controlled the thing in a certain way that gave dignity to it, and he was not obtrusive. But Tito was voluble when he spoke. He was not like the stumble-mums we have who won't do anything that isn't scripted.
Right.
And you know, I can't say, you know, you asked me my impression of him. Well, John Phillips knew him better than any American, because during the war, when Tito was holed up in the cave, and in America they were only saying that he probably doesn't exist. He's been created by journalists. And John dropped into Yugoslavia by parachute with his cameras. Really? And they led him to, he was in touch with the underground, they led him to Tito, and John photographed him there. And it became him a favorite person. Every time he came back to Yugoslavia, you know, the carpet was out. And he had access to Tito all this time. He's written about it in his books. And so I've had a lot of exposure to Yugoslavia and its affairs without having written anything definitive about it. You know, I wrote all kinds of dispatches for Time, and the curse of my Time experience is, well, let's see. No, I have quite a good file on Yugoslavia. Oh, we can talk about photographers.
Sure. I also want to save a little bit of time because you spent a good part of your period of your life in Los Angeles. You did films,
Oh,
right?
my God, yeah, we haven't talked about that at all.
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
Did your paths, just I'm going to throw out a couple names, your paths cross with Abby Mann out in...
No, I know of him.
Yeah.
Didn't know him.
Bud Schulberg?
I met Schulberg once. I didn't like him.
Yeah.
But, you know, it doesn't matter at all.
Sure.
he was kind of full of himself. And there were so many really distinguished people there who weren't full of themselves at all. That, and I didn't find them that interesting. You never, with so many people to talk to, you never pursued somebody that you didn't think was that interesting.
Who was the most, well, let's talk about interesting. Who's interesting people to you? As you reflect back on your days in Los Angeles covering the film and writing about it, the personalities that really grabbed you.
Well, very few of the actors,
Right.
because they come out, you know, they come out as one-dimensional personalities on a one-to-one basis. But as one of the directors said to me, he said, you know, he said, I can invite a lot of people to dinner who might be interesting, but there are very few people I can invite who can turn out to be Napoleon at 8 o'clock in the morning. And, you know, that's the key. And George Stevens, Sr., one of the great men, I remember he was saying to me at the very beginning, and I was early on in this business, and I asked him which actors had he associated with. He said, I don't have anything to do with actors. He meant off the set.
Right.
And, but on the other hand, I made close friends of 3 or 4. Olivia de Havilland is a lifelong friend. We still exchange notes. And let's see, I wrote a story a week about TV or films for 5 years.
For whom? What was the?
For Newsweek in Los Angeles. I was in the Newsweek bureau in Los Angeles. I had to cover, I had stringers in the western states, but I was responsible for everything in Los Angeles and San Francisco. And that meant motion picture industry, aerospace, military rockets, banking, business, a whole lot of things. Los Angeles is one of the most complicated cities in the world. And I said, physically, you know, Hollywood is a series of sets, 20th Fox, MGM, Universal, Paramount, and so on. Vast enclaves patched on the 50 square mile grid that is Los Angeles. Hollywood Boulevard is a tiny little street at the northern end of it that has got stars in the pavement, but it's nothing that would intrigue you very much. And you know, all this, since then they've learned to institutionalize themselves to make it visually important. The Academy of Motion Pictures, which sponsors this big wing-do, was upstairs in a former garage. And the lady who ran it was a librarian, and nobody liked her very much. But that has since blossomed into an institution. They now have a big building in downtown Los Angeles that is visually impressive. And then let's go back to the turn of the century, when the studios would stake out huge sections of the country and convert them into sets for westerns. And it became the most valuable real estate later on. By the time I came along in the late 50s, the studio system was in decline. Stars were demanding and getting a larger share of profits. Marlon Brando made more money for 20 minutes in Apocalypse Now than Clark Gable made in 20 years at MGM. And if you were a correspondent for a national news magazine, you were courted, really, because the exposure for a magazine had a million and a half circulation. And you know, I lunch regularly at the Brown Derby, Fox Commissary, and so on. But unlike a lot of other journalists who do that, I used it to get an education about films. And I interviewed everybody in the business, stuntmen, stars, makeup men, and wrote stories about them, because nobody else had done it very much. And let's see, among the people that I knew well, George Stevens Sr. de Havilland, James Wong Hall, the photographer. Well, I interviewed Dietrich, Dick Powell, de Havilland, Elizabeth Taylor, the Marx Brothers, John Wayne, Gregory Peck, James Arnest, all of them, except some I missed, Bogart and Cooper. And I was much more interested in writers and directors because the whole, there's a big thing that's been going on in motion pictures the last years, and that is that the director is the man. He creates everything, and a lot of people disagree with that, and it has to do with the fact that a writer named Diamond, who wrote a lot of Billy Wilder's pictures, said, he said, it's nonsense. Unless he writes his own script, he's an interpreter. You never saw an ad reading Bernstein's Ninth, written by Beethoven.
Right, right.
And, I was lucky. John Ford, through Dundee Nichols, a writer for screen who was a close friend, I got to know John Ford fairly well. He was inaccessible. He didn't waste his time with journalists. But I went up to his house a couple of times when he wasn't well and just sat there and listened to him talk. And he talked to me about what pictures were like when he first began. He said that you were given a one-page script, told to improvise an event, and you did so over a campfire and a bottle of liquor. And titles covered the gaps later.
Right.
And the best directors let the camera tell the story without titles. The early directors could do that. And then with sound, the burden of narrative shifted to actors and their dialogue. Well, there's more of that, but
Did your paths ever cross with Lucille Ball?
once I interviewed her husband, Desi Arnaz.
Desi Arnaz.
Yeah, and I was waiting there to talk to him in his office until he could be free. I was just across from his desk, and she walked in and said, before he introduced her, he was mad at somebody who was trying to get something from him. He said, "Get that son of a bitch out of my place. I never want to see that asshole again." Mm-hmm. And then he turned to me and he said, "Who are you again?" I said, "I'm from Newsweek." He said, "Oh, for Christ's sake." But Lucille Ball was there. I never, I graded her only, but I never ceased to wonder what a great lady she was. Mm-hmm. I see those things over and over again, and she was such a master of the whole thing. You learn to respect people like that. But that's all gone.
She's from Jamestown, New York, by the way.
Oh, really?
My hometown, right.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Is she memorialized there?
Yeah, they got a Lucy Desi Center.
Have they really?
Right.
Gee. Well, I saw Desi a good deal there. I walked in and out of his studio, and I found him interesting but one-dimensional. She was, one of those great stars, and but I moved around between these different studios, different pictures. I had to write a story a week and see a couple of pictures a week that were being ground out, and but that was only part of my job. On the other hand, I wrote a piece about the RAND Corporation, which was the first think tank after the war, created by the Air Force because they wanted to set up an outfit that would give them independent advice, be independent of the Air Force too, and that would not deal with hardware concepts. And I interviewed everybody at RAND, and I came up with a 5,000 or 10,000 word piece. It sits over there somewhere. And Newsweek didn't run it.
No kidding.
Well, frequently, you know. I got used to that in life. You write the best thing in the world. And I did a marvelous thing, a long piece, the only piece by Hitler's interpreter, Schmidt. Mm-hmm. And it was really the story of the war by the guy who saw it all. And I worked on it for weeks and then didn't run it, you know. So,
how did the compensation work? Did they pay you separately for pieces that they printed? And
oh, no, that was on salary.
okay, so okay.
Yeah.
So whether they printed it or not, other than your ego being bruised, it made no difference.
No, but you know, I showed this thing to RAND, and they were very impressed with it. And they said, "Why don't you come to work for us?" As he said, they said, "You also know a good deal about the political aspects of this space race. Why don't you come to work for us as an assistant to the president and advise him and us on public relations, and also you can do research with the political people." And I said, "Well, that's great." So I spent what, a year and a half or two at RAND.
No kidding.
Yeah, and I did a couple of papers on the subject, and but mostly I was part of it. I was part of the staff. There were about 500 people at RAND, and there were only about 5 or 6 in the front office, and I was one of them. And I sat in on all the staff meetings and had a lot of insight into the way the place worked. And I really wouldn't have left that job, except that the Air Force cut RAND's budget, and I was one of the people that had to go. And
Sure.
and so I came to Washington, where I started out. I went back, and I had known Ed Murrow very well overseas. I'd broadcast for CBS from Vienna, and he, about the time that I came east, he was named director of the U.S. Information Agency, and so it was a natural. I was science advisor, which was to the director and all the media and the rest, and advisor on space, environment, urban problems, medicine, and on what we did with, you know, we had exhibit section, we had 70 posts overseas with the embassies and so on, Voice of America and so on. And it was a job that had been really created for me, you know, given all my past experience. And so I was there for how long? Oh, Jesus, it's not over yet. Shall I go on?
Sure, this is terrific.
Okay.
Terrific. By the way, I should ask, as you reflect on all the pieces you've done and written, my gosh, from the 1930s, are there 2 or 3 articles that really have your imprint on it, that says, gee, this is the one that made a difference, or this was the first one that had some significance?
No, it doesn't work that way. The pieces that were probably significant are those talks that I gave to the Radio Free Europe staff, which were taken down on tape.
Right.
And required no preparation, just, you know. And no, I did a couple of pieces for Life that were very good. But those have disappeared, and I haven't gotten into trying to find them in Life. I guess if you use a computer enough, you could probably find them.
Right.
But no, I don't respond to anything like that. You know, the kind of briefing that I've given you at the beginning of this is probably fairly unique, because very few people have touched bases bases so many times during a very critical period.
Right.
You know, Roosevelt through Lyndon Johnson, through the jokers that have come since. You know, it's a madhouse. And,
All right, so let me get you, but now back to Washington.
yeah.
And
Oh, well, after let's see, I was finally forced to retire at the USIA because of age. And, but I promptly went to work for the State Department,
oh, really?
where, or was there something else in between? No, the State Department. And a lady named Ambassador Jean Wachowski had been named ambassador to a new UN conference that was being set up a year from then.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on how can science and technology improve the lot of the developing countries?
Right.
One of those UN conferences are a year in preparation. They affect the whole bureaucracy by the time they're through. And I worked on this. You know, I wrote speeches for the ambassador and gave her guidance along the way. The State Department ambassadors are fairly limited. You know, they work in a fairly narrow channel, and a guy like me could help. And I did that for about a year, and then when Frank Borman had been around the moon with his crew,
Right.
and one of them was named we talked about Borman and the
No.
oh Jesus, well, one of them was named I forget what, but he'd just been named one of the 3 commissioners for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, created to license new nuclear plants and to be sure the industry was safe. And they had a bureaucracy out in Bethesda, and I was hired for them to be one of the, said they had two very good PR guys, and I was added to add another dimension to them, again, speech writing. And I worked for them for about a year, and then at this point, I knew so much about the problems of the industry that there was a PR outfit that still handles a lot of things like that, Burson Marsteller, one of the best-known law firms here.
Right.
And they hired me for a year to advise on speeches and stuff. And then at that point, this would now be the early 90s, I met Dick Clark, a former senator from Iowa,
Right.
who had been a professor of international relations before that and who had a strong interest in European affairs. I met him because my wife had known his wife's mother when they were both in Cuba. My wife had a notable career in Cuba. She got a huge obituary in the Post when she died a few months ago. Her picture's there. And I'd met Dick Clark. This is the concluding chapter. We can go back to whatever.
Sure.
But I met Dick Clark at his home for dinner because we became friends. And he said, you know, I've got this conference for members of Congress coming up on various things. And he said, I'm interested in Eastern Europe, but I don't know anything about it. And I said, well, Dick, I do.
Right.
He said, well, then organize a couple of trips there. So I did the itinerary. I located the experts we should interview and the embassy staffs and people in opposition to them and so on to get a rounded picture. And and then I advanced the trips, which is important. All trips like that fall apart unless they're advanced with everything nailed down. And I'd also, before this, advanced astronaut trips. you know, that's not things, a separate thing altogether.
Right.
And so Dick and I did 3 trips to Eastern Europe. All 7 countries involved. James Eagleburger, Undersecretary then, was all for the trips, and because they were going to educate members of Congress, and he okayed the project, and we had complete access to everybody, embassy staffs outside, and then I took over the whole job of who we should see, when, and what the itinerary was going to be, and I did all the arrangements on the trips. And we did 3 of these, and turned out to be really remarkable reports for their time.
Right.
And I'm still with them. That was 91. I'm still with Dick on this project, which is the Aspen Institute. It's now called, the conferences produce the Congressional International Program. And it's created for members of Congress to permit them to get educated about things they don't know enough about.
Right.
They aren't ignorant of them. Members of Congress have no time for anything, not even to read the paper. And so I've been doing this for Dick. You know, it's distinctly a subsidiary role, but again, my extra 20 years of experience in this kind of stuff turns out to be valuable. Partly because people who have that span of interest and knowledge don't usually last that long.
You're remarkable. Are there highlights, if you had to reflect back and say, all right, Greg, these are the 2 or 3 highlights of my life, what would they be?
Oh, hell. Oh, I couldn't do that. You know, odd moments in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Odd moments in Hollywood come to mind. And then the people I was permitted to come to know. I went to Texas to cover Texas has been through a whole series of disasters: floods, storms, fires. And my editor said, look, that's part of your territory. Why don't you go there and pick out the place that's most interesting and write about it? So I went to Texas, and I remembered that Stanley Walker, the great city editor of New York Tribune,
Right.
had retired there to his farm. And so I looked him up. And that became a brief friendship. He died shortly afterwards, but also on that trip, there's a separate thing that Farm Security Administration make a note of that. But I looked up several of their photographers. Oh, I better get it. Excuse me.
Here, let me get that mic, that all-impressive mic.
Oh, I'm sorry, of course.
Here you go.
You still going?
Yep. We're going well.
No, the telephone stopped.
No, I just stopped you.
Okay. Well, I'm still with Dick after all these years, and I'm part of the apparatus. I'm not the foremost part of it, but
I should ask you, how old are you?
91, I'll be 92 in a few months.
You don't look it at all.
No, I'm lucky.
You must keep physically active.
I did.
Yeah.
I now have this leg problem.
Yeah,
But, you know, for years I swam all over the goddamn place, and it gave me a certain physique that apparently is a carryover.
it's clear.
But, let's see.
As you were talking about some odd moments in Hollywood, what were some of those oddball?
Well, Sophia Loren
Yes.
came there on a to make his first picture, and there was a welcome party for her the night before she went to work at the Romanoff's restaurant, which I do well. I knew Romanoff well, and it produced a marvelous picture of Lauren was seated with, oh come on, I know her name, the lady with the full bosom.
Jane Russell.
No, not Jane Russell, but like Jane Russell a little bit. A very considerable character in Hollywood because she was flamboyant and had a beautiful figure. But anyhow, they were seated together.
Is Jane Mansfield or?
Jane Mansfield. Yeah. And there was Lauren looking down at her bosom as though, my God.
Yeah.
And, but the next day I interviewed her in, at the Fox Studios in the commissary. And when I walked in with her, all the necks in the commissary turned, you know. These are people who see beautiful women all the time.
Right.
But her beauty was really transcendent. And I interviewed her, and I went back to my office and I wrote some kind of a story. And but I picked up the phone and sent her a dozen long-stemmed beautiful roses.
You probably didn't do that for anybody else, did you?
No, I've done it for a few women since, but
yeah.
never for anybody in the pictures. And she had the most beautiful neck of anybody I've ever seen. And you know, that was a transcendent moment. But there were a good many because, you know, Olivia de Havilland could produce magic no matter what. And but the most interesting people I met were really writers. And I miss Billy Wilder as a director. I don't know why. And but well, I was going to talk to you about photography. When I was at, wait a minute, where the hell are we here now? Well, the chief thing is that I grew up in the great age of black and white photography, journalism mostly. There was nothing like it before, nothing like it since, and we owe what we have mostly to Henry Luce, who is smarter than anybody about what the hell the American public would need. He created Time, Life, and Fortune. And Life magazine, John Phillips, who is wiser than the photographers, once defined it. He said, it taught Americans what civilization is and was. And the stable of Life photographers was remarkable. You know, all of them are great men since, and they have museums pay millions for their pictures and so on. And this coincided, Life coincided with Look magazine, which was at the other end of this thing there. It wasn't as good, but it was trying to do the same thing. You know, Leo Roston, a wonderful writer whom I know at Hollywood, used to do interpretive pieces on the great painters and thinkers for Look. You couldn't put them in any magazine in America today. Right. And so, you know, I knew Roston and all those people. Most of all, I came to know the photographers well because a lot of the photographers who became photographers working for the Farm Security Administration drifted into Life later on and became luminaries there. That goes for Carl Meidens and a whole host of others. But what happened was that Redford Tugwell was the Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, and he was responsible for the parts of farming and agriculture and farmers that weren't doing very well, that were having trouble. And it usually went back to, you know, Oklahoma, Skid Row, and the farms in the field, and all these people in the 30s were migrating to California with nothing but the clothes on their back. And Tugwell hired a man named Roy Stryker, whose name is now illustrious in photography. Stryker created this group of photographers to record what was happening to agriculture in America. They were all of them men. Their work now is in all the great photographic collections. I met them because I knew a woman who worked in Tugwell's office, and she said, "The most interesting thing that is happening here, everything else is transient, but those pictures are going to last."
Right.
She said, "You ought to go over there and get acquainted with Stryker and what he's doing." And of course, my usual facility for developing empathy with great men came to the fore, and I was above all a good listener, and I knew how to prompt things moving along. And Stryker is S-T-R-Y-K-E-R, Roy Stryker.
Right.
And there are now 5 or 6 books written about him and his unit. And Stryker would sit there and talk to me about what his people were doing and why. And then I came to know some of them. One of them was John Vachon, V-A-C-H-O-N. I've got a big book like that in the other room. It just came out. Vachon came from Minnesota, Irish, somewhat alcoholic, and he never said very much. But everything brewed, and he produced wonderful photographs. He was hired by UNRWA to photograph what they were doing in Poland after the war, and it produced a wonderful book. But I was then living in Washington on not Half Moon Street, but what the hell is it again? Jefferson Place. And Vachon and another friend of mine became very close. Vachon nobody knew about this at the time, but Vachon wanted to deliver a message to the president, and he somehow couldn't get it to him. And one night when he had had a drink or two, he climbed the fence of the White House.
Really?
Yeah. The White House had a fence about this high.
Mm-hmm.
There was no security around the goddamn grounds.
Right.
And and now we've got, you know what. Anyhow, Vachon was picked up by the Secret Service. And they interrogated him, and then they found out that when he was sober, he was just a photographer. They let him go.
I'll be darned.
But I came to know Vachon and his wife Penny and that whole group. But above all, I came to know Russell Lee, a Texas photographer who was just marvelous. And Marion Post, who was a stunningly beautiful woman, who again her pictures and books are collected. And who else? Carl Mydance was there. And see, the Farm Security group, they were the father of 7 out of 10 of the great luminaries since. You know, the men who illuminated life. And also the other, see, I was working on both sides, but then I began to get involved with the Magnum people. Do you know about Magnum?
Yep.
And I came to know some of them very well. As a matter of fact, Eric Lessing, who was one of the Magnum people when he was very young, he came out of Vienna. And I was on the phone with him the other day, and he sent me a new copy of a book, of a picture book that he's edited in the other room. It's on Austria from the beginning of the occupation of the State Treaty. Wonderful photographs. And Lessing is, there are very few good photographers who become entrepreneurs. One is Homey, but Lessing he began to photograph pictures in paintings in museums, which is a special art.
Right.
Dmitri Kisselov was the only man who could do it. Then he went. And Lessing has a monopoly on that, and he has photographed most of the great museums and what's in them. And when people want, the museums are glad to have it off their back.
Sure.
And Lessing has photographed all this. He has a crew of about 7 people working in his office in Vienna. And not only that, he's just a nice man, as nice a man as ever. And I'm in touch with him. But Farm Security, Magnum, Life.
Did you have any chance to interface with Tugwell at all?
No, I didn't, unhappily. I saw him around the place,
Right.
but my interests weren't that diverse that I would, I knew what he was doing was interesting. Oh, I had a man named Tom Karsten, about whom I'd been known at the University of Chicago, who was a lawyer who worked for Tugwell. And I used to get stories about him from Tom.
What's the skinny on Tugwell? What kind of guy was he?
Oh, Tugwell was just a nice guy and brilliant, who didn't waste words and never got truly angry. It was necessary. I should think that I would have come out of that with knowing more about Tugwell, but the memories fade. I probably did once, because Karsten told me everything.
Yeah. This is so terrific.
Well, the chief thing about it is that, first, I've lived longer, and secondly, I haven't lived that long. There are a lot of people in their 90s who are articulate. But what is that my changing interest, the fact that I was interested in everything and everybody, Victor Gruen, a Los Angeles architect and city planner, whom I'd known somewhat in, there's too much.
This has been terrific. Just terrific. I can't thank you enough.
Oh, what happens is I'm very glad to do it. You're a very good person to do this because, first of all, you know what the hell you're doing,